Hey, Composing Gloves here. I'm wearing a hat, and today we're going to be talking about reverb. So you just learned about delays from the previous two videos and how to listen for them. Well, let's learn how to check out reverb. Now, there's two types of reverb. We're going to be looking at algorithmic reverb in this one. There is convolution reverb. I'll briefly cover that idea near the end, but it's not a super big deal. So let me just pull up a convolution reverb just to be sure that I've got it here to remind myself. Okay, so now I'm going to play for you a sound, and we learned in the last video that delay can create quite a nice sense of space. But with reverb, it's a little more accurate, but it can muddy your mix. But understanding, now we're looking at listening for reverb. In reality, when people say muddy or whatnot, that's a pretty general, like, blanket term. Like, you could say that about like a lot of things. So it's more important to have a personal connection with how something sounds and knowing what it does to a sound. So I have here a pluck sound, and I'm going to disengage the reverb. That's what it sounds like. Now let's turn the reverb on. So reverb is used to give us a sense of space. It's used pretty much that. A sense of position and space, mostly space. Early reflections can give us a sense of position. They can also augment our sense of position. For example, a poorly placed set of speakers could really augment our sense of where things are in a stereo image. Now, since this is an algorithmic reverb, we do not need to worry about that. They've made a reverb that does not emulate standing waves or anything like that. However, we do have a mid-side option here, but we're not going to talk about that in this video. So what this is so we have our reverb going, and what we're going to do is we are going to identify the things that give us the cues about a room. So we have a room, and the best way to really hear what a reverb sounds like is what you need to do is you need to clap in a room. So a clap is a very transient thing. So you would clap in a room and then listen, try to identify what sound of your clap is direct sound that hits you first, and then what sound is the reverb sound of the room. So you'll go into different rooms, and if you can, record them, and go into a whole bunch of different rooms. Go into gymnasiums, go into your school gymnasium, a church gymnasium, your room, your buddy's room, the living room. I don't know why I keep thinking of basketball courts, but a basketball court, some different bunch of different spaces, an open field outside, and record yourself clapping, and then pay attention to how the reverb, the space changes in each room. There's a bunch of cool art recordings, whatever you want to call them, where a guy is singing a bunch of different spaces and they chop it all together so that it forms one cohesive video. It's really cool. I forgot the name of it. I'll have to find it. But what that does is it gives you the ability to hear reverb, because that's something that takes a little while to grasp and understand. So if we clap, I hear it in here. I get a little bit of a flutter echo, and it's a very short reverb. So it's just the way my room sounds, and I know that. And honestly, I should treat it a little bit better. But I know what it sounds like, I know how it works, and I know how it translates across to other systems, so I can work in my room and do professional level work. And I also, and most importantly, I also go and I check it, in my car over different headphones. I send it to friends and have them listen to it if you have the luxury of friends who know what they're doing, and you can get a bunch of feedback. And since they're listening to it on different systems, and I also have a number of speakers in here just for experimenting, as well as I have a much bigger system downstairs for experimenting. And that's just going to it's going to take this space out of a mix so that I can hear and understand what I'm listening to, and how much of it is the space that I'm in, and how much of it is the space I recorded in, and how much of it is the reverb that I put on it. So you see, this is quite a deep topic. There's a lot to talk about. So let's get into some of these controls here. Now, we didn't talk about absorption coefficients in my basic acoustic definitions, the one that's entitled like diffusion, resonance, refraction, diffraction. But one of them is absorption coefficient. So whenever a sound bounces around in a room, it's going to bounce off those surfaces. When a sound bounces off of a surface and then comes straight back to you, so it only bounces off one surface and then comes back to you, that's called an early reflection. Those are very important. Those are the loudest reflections you're going to get. You'd be actually pretty surprised at how loud reflected sound can actually sound in comparison to direct sound. It can really mess with you. And in a room, with 3 parallel surfaces, there are 6 early reflection points. So there's one off that wall, there's one off this wall, there's one off this one. Now, of course, sound isn't just a line, so it's like a wave, but there's like, we're gonna call it 1 point just for simplicity's sake. So, anyways, you have them off of each of the walls. Now, depending on the number of walls, parallel surfaces, and a couple other features, you can actually augment these early reflections in unusual ways. But there will always be one for wall. So, like if I had wall now, if you've got diffusers on the wall, then that's another story. You can actually make it so that sound will avoid the middle section, will avoid a particular area. For example, a concave roof, something that's like a dome roof. Is that concave? I don't even know. But anyways, a dome-like roof, when it hits in there, it'll actually focus the sound to the center and down. Most of the sound will go there. And so that sort of roof. Now, if you imagine if it bulges out like this, if it bulges out like a sphere type thing, it's going to send sound in all directions. It's not going to focus it. It's actually going to splay the sound out in different directions, making it less likely to go where it came from. A lot less sound is going to go there now. Indeed, some sound will hit it in a way, and there's also angular reflections, which we are not going to talk about. But basically, this all contributes to the way a room sounds. So people want well-diffused rooms because it will spread the sound around in all these different directions, making it more even. At least that's the goal. And then they also want well-absorbed rooms to take control of frequencies that could be problematic. So they want to absorb frequencies that ring out or are an issue in a room, which ironically in rooms of my size are frequencies that are rather large, and it's kind of hard to absorb those in a controllable way. So we've come up with all sorts of different ways, and there's ways of calculating frequencies that are the problem frequencies, and that's an acoustic course that we're not going to delve into. That's what I'm studying right now too. So it's really interesting. But what we need to know about reverb is all this stuff just has to do with creating a space. So if you're outside, we know things are just going to fly past you once. So we would never need a reverb in an outdoor space. Things would just go on forever. And it's ironic because in a free field, if you were to look at this in a cartoon, they usually put like a really big echo or something, like they're in a big room. But the thing is, there would be nothing for the sound to bounce off of except the floor. So there would actually be no echo. It would just, your voice would actually be really dry in a free field. And the particles are spread out more and more and more as they get farther and farther away. So it would get softer as you're farther and farther away, but there would be no like, hello, oh, like there wouldn't be any of that jazz going on. Now, if you're in a big room, of course there is, because it's going to hit a surface, it's going to bounce back. So we have here this low cut and a high cut. Those are representing the absorption coefficients, which I started talking about. That's when it hits a thing, and then the object it will absorb and reflect a certain frequencies. The absorption coefficients, obviously, what frequencies it tends to absorb. And then there's also transmission. We're not going to get into all this, but basically we need to be aware of how a particular material will absorb frequencies. Does it absorb them all? Does it absorb them equally? You know, things like that. It's not an easy topic, but there are some general rules about high frequencies. High frequencies are far more easily absorbed than low frequencies. So especially in air. So in a room, high frequencies are the ones that are likely to just go away just from the air. So if you were in a free field full of air, so I guess it's not like a free field because there's air there, but you need a medium for the sound to go through. If you're in a free field and you're really far away, if you're far enough away, low frequencies, you'll hear the person way over there. You'll hear the low frequencies depending on where you're standing in the inverse square law. But the high frequencies will actually, some of it will be absorbed by friction in the air. And so we could calculate this and get the absorption coefficient of air. I've not learned how to do that. I've always just been, handed whatever it was. I'm assuming you just shoot out things and do some measurements and use some math and you get the answer to however that system responds. And then you can say, oh, this is how much it absorbs of high end. So basically rooms will have that. So you'll cut off some of the high end for your reverb to make it sound like it is in a room. So if we have a high cut, so we cut some and we could see what we're cutting up here, what frequencies, and we have our low frequency cut. The other thing is, how big is the room? Is the room a large room? If your room, now I realize I'm doing a lot of talking, but this is just the way you got to know all this stuff. In a big room, obviously it's going to take longer for things to get back to you. And of course we have those different absorption coefficients, but also when you're in a room, it's almost never like just a closed room. You have things in your room. I have a bookcase in my room. You have things going on in a room. So like if you're in an auditorium, there's going to be seats and everywhere, and all these things will play a role in what frequencies sort of make it and which ones don't. And you can fix that by the absorption coefficients and manipulating the materials things are made out of and stuff, which would affect the absorption coefficient. So a big room, basically, though, they'll take longer for those early reflection points to get back to you. And oftentimes, a big room isn't big in all directions. So you'll be like big really far that way, but maybe the walls on your sides are a bit closer than the walls here. And usually the one back here is pretty close. And usually in a big room, the ceiling's pretty high, but you have the floor right there. So you have these early reflection points come back to you at very different times. And sometimes second order reflections can beat the early reflections. If it's going off a really far wall, they might have time to bounce off two surfaces and reach you before an early reflection comes and hits you. So it can get kind of complicated. But this ER represents these early reflections. And we just got done talking about diffusion, which is how a sound bounces around in room. Well, we can control the number of spaces. Now, we have something called Flutter, which it basically Flutter sounds sort of like this. So if we get a really short sort of decay time and there's no pre-delay, and you see that's what Flutter kind of sounds like. And it's just this, yeah. See, it sounds very like a delay. And so that's generally not a desirable sound. And you see we were working in a cube, which is actually what most people are working in. So you want to augment your cube so it's not a cube. But if we diffuse it better, check out what it sounds like. Sounds way, way, way different. Now, this is still a very short time. So our decay time is very short because now in a big room, your decay time will actually be quite a bit longer. But also, you could be in a big room that's also dead. If it's very absorbative, then it could also be dead. I've not studied anechoic chambers, but I'm curious to see how big the space is. I've watched videos and read up about them, but I've not looked at them in detail. I'm curious to see how big the space generally is when you're in them, because those absorbers and the treatments they use have to be really friggin' big and to absorb. If you don't know what an anechoic chamber is, it's a very absorbative chamber. They actually achieve decibels of negative decibels. It's so quiet, it's below the threshold of human hearing. I believe the record was negative 23 decibels. It's somewhere down there. It's in the negative 20s. Might be even lower. I don't even know, but it's really freaking low. So yeah, you go check that out. It's kind of a cool topic. But anyways, the absorbers have to be super thick, and they do all these different techniques to just absorb everything. So anyways, diffusion will affect that. Pre-delay has to do with that whole, the room may be so big, or you may be in a place where you might get some reverb off the floor or whatever, but the vast majority of the reverb will actually has to go all the way out, bounce off these walls, and come all the way back to get to you. And so you can actually achieve a really clean, big sounding room with a shorter decay time. Maybe it's a more absorbative room. So it will absorb things. It won't let things ring out as much. It's not as excited by resonance, but you have this delay. And so this can make things, and you see this is in milliseconds if you look up here. And you should be very familiar with this millisecond thing from the Haas effect. So we can delay sound. And actually, we could use a shorter reverb, so it's a lot cleaner of a reverb. It's sort of a mix between a delay and a reverb. So algorithmic reverbs are very powerful like that. If we play them, it's actually anyways, that'll make it sound a lot bigger because there's a space that it takes to go all the way out and back. We use that as a cue. It's an intensity in a print. It's a timing cue. That's what that is. That is a timing cue. And if we increase this, obviously the room gets bigger. Now, it's not so when I just pluck notes once, they're like, oh, that doesn't sound that great. But try it on your recordings, because when it's a continuous system, once the reverb starts, it doesn't stop. So just try it on different things. It did sound really different on transients, and we discovered that because the Haas effect takes on very different ways of approaching and releasing off a sound when you introduce something. Now, it's not necessarily the Haas effect because this is reverb, because it takes so long for it to get back to you. But what I'm saying is transients will respond really differently than a string section will. So you want to try this because it could actually offer you a great sense of space and lushness without having to add in a whole load of additional reflections that you didn't need in the first place. Might not even like. So you want to try this out. Size, obviously, is the size of your room. So I tend to go with the shorter delays. But occasionally I'll find myself rounding out around here, somewhere sort of a weird, lengthy one. Especially if I'm doing like a longer sound. Maybe filtered. So you see, it sounds really nice. So it just depends on what you're working with. Okay, so now let's talk about, so we have our diffusion, which of course is how many early reflections. Let's peel this part a little bit more, because we're listening to reverb. We have dampening too, which is a very common setting. High dampening, basically, it just, your high frequencies aren't filtered out like they are right here. Instead, they are dampened. So in the reverb side of things, so you still have your direct high sound, but then your high frequencies will be in the reverb will be turned down quicker, so that like a normal, like an actual room would respond. So it's different than filtering them out, because they still get a ring out, they just ring out a lot less and for a shorter amount of time. So it's like, what is this? Off, no dampening. And yeah, not very many rooms sound like that, but this is a very badly diffused room. So you see, that's quite different. Now, if we take the dampening and put it as default. So that's just a general, that's the tone you get. Well, it's very similar to the tone you get by default in this plug. Somewhere around there. So see, that's sort of a brighter room. And so we can begin to emulate things. Now, if you really want to emulate stuff, you will let things run through this clean. And you might consider using dampening still, and there's a couple other settings that I'm not going to delve into. I cover this plugin in the FL12 Effects series. But if you go to the send, you can actually put an EQ and then this plugin, and you can get a really authentic reverb sound, because you'll EQ it to do the profile that you want, and then let this thing do the rest, add the reverb. Okay, so we've talked about that. We've talked about diffusion. Let's look at this and wet. Now, good plugins worth their salt will give you an So actually, I take that back. There are some really, really cool plugins that will dynamically take care of some of these things, and they're sort of musical in the sense that you're not thinking about all this stuff. But anyways, this is the early reflections. They give you control over those first reflections in their algorithm. And then the wet is the late reflection. So if we get rid of the dry, we can hear what just the wet and the sound like. And I'm using very transient sounds right now, so they stick out a little bit more. The differences will be a little more obvious. Now let's get rid of the You see, to me, it's the way I explain it is they sound more like puffs of smoke, like puff, 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 instead of doot, 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 because the reflections. Now, there's a whole load of different ways you could calculate this, which is why different reverb plugins can sound so different. These reflections are it's pretty hard to understate how important these can really be in making your reverb sound really nice. Massive, for example, I hate their early reflections with a passion. I do not like the way they sound. I don't mind them at first, but I really wish they would change it. So if we go to reverb, see, they have a small reverb versus regular reverb. It's just different settings. But if we turn this, you hear those clicks at the beginning? That's like terrible. I want different algorithms. So I have to, a lot of the time, I don't like using it in here. It's kind of hard when you're making a preset pack for that, because you're like, I don't want to use reverb. I'll reach for their delay instead, or something else, but not that. So anyways, I use that a lot. You get used to getting the sound you want out of it, but I would way rather reach for something else. Some reverbs you want to be careful too. You can change the pitch of it. Some people swear that the Deverb plug does that, but it's whatever. Or maybe you're really rich and you have Altiverb, so you're like, I've got the reverb plugin of plugins. Okay, so that's that. Now let's look at, so we have the wet and the Let's look at how it sounds with a very undiffused thing. So some very few surfaces. This will actually cause us to have less early reflections. The number of walls in your room will determine that. And is it on? It's not even on. Here it is. Nope, it is on. Wow. I know, something's weird. Something's going on. It's not coming out at 17. I'm playing the wrong sound. There we go. I'm like, that was weird. Okay. So you see how much more plinging is going on? We take rid of. Even your wet reflections are severely affected by this. If we turn it up. Okay, now let's look at something else that's pretty important for you to know. Your reflections are not affected by your decay. They're in this algorithm. In reality, they would be, because they might be going really far away or whatever, and so you might have pre-delay. I'm not sure if pre-delay would incorporate it with this decay setting, but basically, this your decay, right? Let's say we have a really freaking long decay. What was that, 15 seconds or something? Something's insane. But see, it doesn't even affect that. But if we turn our wet up, check it out. It's still going. And this can sound really, really nice, but at the same time, this is such a long delay. You are going to be regretting this if you have a lot of sound going through this and you want a clean sound and recording. You're not going for that really atmospheric loss of direction type of feel. If you want things to be like crisp and poignant, unless they're separated in frequency. Now, you should keep in mind that combination tones, beat frequencies, all those things will be changed and sometimes made substantially worse by things like this, which is where some of that mud comes from, the mysterious mud that just seems to appear out of nowhere in a mix, where it's all of a sudden sounds, oh, this doesn't sound very defined anymore. But you got that. So you see, we could come through here now and you see we have like a drum room, which is usually a pretty tight, small room. And this is a very bright room too. We have a large hall. And so you can begin to make, now, hopefully you're at the point now where you can go in a room and listen. You can have some expectations on what that room will probably sound like. And then you can actually have opinions on the possibilities you could do with treating that room by moving around like gobos or absorbers, whatever you use. I've always heard they were called gobos. So you move these things called gobos around. They're basically big absorbers. And sometimes they have reflective gobos that are like have glass on them. So you could control these things. So you might put a reflective gobos around a piano in a particular way, and then like absorbative gobos around a piano in another way, or do a mix match to get the piano to sound just the way you want in your recording session. So just some nice sounds. Cathedral is known for having longer reverb. Now let's talk about convolution reverb. Now this one, all the same things about how a room sounds applies. It just, some people are probably going to wonder about this. All it is you take a sample of a, they're called IR samples. Usually that brings it up. Here we go. And so we have all these short sounds, and they're basically a transient response of the space. And then you have an algorithm that extracts what the reverb was from the space. And then it applies that reverb tail using convolving, which is very common in DSP. I believe this is how it works. I'm not like an expert at DSP. But basically, it takes that and applies it to each sample of your audio. Or I'm not sure if it's each sample, but it applies it to your audio on a sample level, giving different amplitude changes accordingly. And that produces the output. And that's how you get the reverb sound. So you can theoretically go in, and if you watch the Altiverb video they have a really good video on convolution reverb because they're Altiverb. They show you the before and after, and it pretty much sounds the same. Like, it's pretty cool. So you can capture a room response. However, you do want to, there are subtle issues. I'm not going to delve into all the subtle issues. But if we turn this off, and let's see, right now, this is some sort of let's go into small rooms. Now, these are phenomenal. You can go online and find all sorts of free, these are called impulse response samples. Now, there's a couple ways of getting these. I'm not going to explain that. But for example, we could take that and so it sounds like a small room, and well, that's what it is a small room. We have a bathroom. And let's go over here to halls. I'm expecting these to sound a bit bigger. Okay, we have Montclair Church. There's a city named Montclair near me. Yeah. Take out the dry, put in the wet, the dry. Get some interesting things. Now, what's cool about this, though, is you get really experimental and put things in there that are not IR samples, like maybe a scream, or maybe you want to put in there a water bottle crinkling, I don't know, a battery falling, a child crying, something, and then you get some really weird reverb sounds. But yeah, it's pretty cool. They had one in there named guitar cabinets. I thought it was guitars, but you could do some pretty cool things. So Yeah. Anyways, I'm going to leave it at that. If you have any questions about this, let me know. Hopefully this was informative, and now you can listen to Reverb and be like, oh, also it's kind of useful on the mixing side because now you know between delay, you know about this reverb. Oh, one thing that we could probably talk about is a short decay time of under 100 milliseconds. So like 0.1 second, under a second basically. That, or 100 milliseconds. So 0.1 is as far as it goes. So you other reverb plugins will allow you to get sort of closer. You can get it'll tend to make sound bigger because this will put sounds farther away, right? Because that gives us a sense of space. So if something's covered in reverb, if we have less dry and more of the reverb, then it's going to be covered more in reverb. Now, you generally don't want to use reverbs as inserts. You want to use them as sends for workflow reasons, but we're not going to bother with that right now. But so if we have a really, really short reverb, they tend to they make sound bigger rather than farther away a lot of the time. Now, of course, I have turned down my dry. So you can experiment with that. It doesn't always hold true, but it is something that happens quite often. So yes, if you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe, support me on Patreon, and have a blessed day.